Welcome to all from around the globe today. We're so delighted that you're joining us for what I'm sure will be an insightful and engaging discussion focused on the Global Book Alliance's work to understand and strengthen the global book supply chain. As you may already be aware, our mission at the Global Book Alliance is to transform the lives of millions of children in developing countries by working with public, private, and civil society partners to identify, promote, and support innovations, best practices, and policies that will change the way that books are created, procured, and provided. We are joined today by GBA and USAID colleagues, as well as partners in government, library services, and publishing who are already engaged in understanding the book supply chain and working to ensure the right books are available at the right level, in the right language, in the right places for readers in Malawi, Zambia, and beyond. I'd like to introduce the Deputy Chair of the Global Book Alliance, Scott Walter, to join us as moderator for today's event and provide some additional background on the Global Book Alliance.
Welcome, everyone. It's a pleasure to have everyone from around the world on this. The Alliance was founded in 2017 to guarantee that children everywhere have the learning materials they need to learn to read by 2030. So this ambitious vision demands market-based transformation. I find that a very important point, market-based transformation in book planning, development, production, procurement, distribution, and use. So it's a complex and interconnected set of processes and actors that we call the book chain. The GBA works to ensure books and other teaching materials are procured, written, published, distributed, and used, ensuring children can access developmentally appropriate books in languages they speak and understand. The global book supply chain analysis, supported by USAID, and implemented by EDC, is undertaking supply chain analysis in 6 countries to date, despite the restrictions of COVID-19. And today, we'll be hearing about the analysis undertaken and the learnings gained and the next steps we're working on with partners in Malawi and Zambia. Our work with our collaborators, funders, partners, and supporters helps the Alliance increase literacy rates, support a healthier book market, and ensure all have access to books that pave the way for greater access. So to get us started, we'd like to share with you a new short video that brings the work of the GBA and the role of a strong book supply chain to life.
Imagine trying to learn to read without books. Imagine being expected to succeed in school, but having no books to study or no learning materials available in languages you understand. Globally, 617 million children and youth are not achieving minimum reading proficiency. This illiteracy impacts individual learners' life chances, as well as the health and resilience of their families and communities. Failure to read is estimated to cost the global economy $129 billion per year. The global book gap is a major driver of this learning crisis. Only 4% of children in Bangladesh and 22% in Ghana have 3 or more books to read at home, whilst books that are available often have too many words per page for beginning readers. However, investing in books and materials paired with teacher training and support has reliably been proven to have significant impact on student outcomes. So why are essential and appropriate reading materials missing from schools, libraries, and homes in so many low and middle-income countries? The answer has to do with the book supply chain. This chain is made up of the interconnected steps that a book takes, from planning and writing through printing, purchasing, and distribution, until it is in the hands of a child. The Global Book Alliance has identified 6 steps in this chain. In many countries, some or all of the elements of this chain are weak or broken. Governments may have difficulty planning and budgeting for sufficient book purchasing and distribution. The local publishing sector may struggle with low demand, high unit costs, prohibitive taxation, or market corruption. Available books may not be culturally or developmentally appropriate, or they may be printed in languages foreign to learners. Print specifications, including paperweight and binding, may be substandard, with the result that books wear out quickly. Books may be damaged or lost during distribution. Books that arrive at schools may be in the wrong quantities, delivered at the wrong time of year, or stored in poor conditions. Since books are usually in short supply, learners rarely have sufficient opportunity to work with books in class, and in many countries, learners are not allowed to take books home. Even if all these challenges are addressed, one more often remains. Without training to strengthen their ability to teach reading and literacy, teachers often do not know how to best use the books available. The Global Book Alliance works to develop strong book supply chains around the world so that all children have access to high-quality, culturally relevant, interesting books in their own languages. The Alliance strives to ensure that books are available, appropriate, affordable, and accessible to all. We use supply chain research, training, and innovative funding initiatives to help reshape and rebalance book market operations so that demand for high-quality books will both increase and be met with sufficient supply. We help stakeholders across the book supply chain, like governments, publishers, and printers, NGOs, schools, and parents, to play their roles more efficiently and to leverage market efficiencies that stabilize provision and exchange of essential reading materials across all country contexts. How reliable is the book supply chain for young learners in your country? What is needed to help strengthen it? Let's join together and ensure that all children have the necessary books to learn to read and to read to learn. Engage with the Global Book Alliance at www.globalbookalliance.org to learn more.
So I'm delighted to welcome Juliana Nielsen, Senior Technical Advisor at the Global Book Alliance in Action, a USAID-supported initiative housed at Education Development Center focused on understanding and supporting the global book supply chain, the global digital library, and publishers networks and training. Juliana has over 25 years of experience working in educational publishing in the United States. She's directed the development of print and digital markets materials for publishers such as Pearson Education, Houghton Mifflin, and McGraw-Hill. For the past several years, she has worked in materials development and publisher training in Senegal for USAID and in Morocco for the European Union, before joining EDC as the Senior International Technical Advisor for GBA, IA, or GBA. Juliana has an MA in International Relations from the Fletcher School and an MA in French from Middlebury College. Juliana will provide an overview of the supply chain analysis process, research strategy, and a snapshot of common findings from Malawi and Zambia. Over to you, Juliana.
Thank you so much, Seth. And thank you to everyone for joining us today for this webinar. I will try not to have any technical difficulties. So during our book chain analyses, we try to remain focused on essential reading materials and on the faces of the children that you see on the screen. Our primary goal is to ensure that children have access to these critical books in languages that they can understand. Because, however, in almost every country we look at, the official procurement of books by ministries of education tends to be of textbooks only. We look closely at the book supply chain for textbooks with an eye towards opening up new pathways for essential reading materials. There is therefore a clear advocacy piece that is running throughout our work. We're encouraging new and innovative thinking about how systems can transform themselves in order to get more books to children in the lower grades so they can learn to read. Throughout our work, the aim of increasing literacy is what guides us. So for the research, our primary research methodology is qualitative through key stakeholder interviews. Extensive desk research is also conducted, and surveys of existing reading materials are also carried out. The important stakeholders that we consult during our research include members of ministries, publishers, authors and illustrators, printers, distributors, school leaders, teachers, students, parents, and community members, as well as regional and district leaders, donors, NGOs, and implementing partners. So the first high-level questions that we ask as we begin a new study: what is the overall book provision system? Is it a state monopoly publishing? Is it private sector publishing, or is it a hybrid? Is the system for textbooks only, or does it include essential reading materials? What is the current state of early grade teaching and materials development in the country? What methodology is being used, and what are the materials used to teach it? And is there time in class schedules for children to read and to be read to? Is there an understanding of the particular needs of early grade reading materials in the country? What donors and NGOs are working in the sector? What are the past and ongoing projects involving early grade reading materials in the country? What are the main challenges in getting books to the children in the country, et cetera? And then we dig down deeper from those initial questions with each stakeholder. The interviews with stakeholders are tractable. They're conducted in a manner to encourage probing and further inquiry. The book sector in each country has, of course, its own challenges and barriers. Nonetheless, we have identified many common themes in Zambia and Malawi as we conducted our research. We're going to point out just a few of them during this presentation. The full reports are again on the Global Book Alliance website, so please do have a look at them. Next slide, please. So in Malawi, these tables reflect the book supply chain that was presented at the very beginning of the video, and that is also on the Global Book Alliance site. It points to the actual breaks in the chain. So in Malawi, as said earlier, there's no government budget for essential reading materials. They only plan, the Ministry of Education only plans and forecasts for textbooks only. And this you'll see running through both of these chains. So in title development, for example, publishers don't develop essential reading materials because there is no money to do so, no funding. There's a lack of private sector engagement, therefore, down to publishing and printing because of the lack of market demand and incentive. Publishers have a limited capacity to develop essential reading materials. Purchasing, there's no essential reading materials to procure, so the ministry only procures textbooks. There's also an issue that runs across both Malawi and Zambia, which is that there have been corruption scandals in the book sector in the past several years, which have caused donors to pull out of pooled funding and go to project-based funding in general. And we find that pooled funding would help governments to plan consistently for their book procurement and therefore open up from textbooks to essential reading materials. Distribution management, books tend to arrive late and there's no track and trace system. And in active use, schools have extremely limited supply of essential reading materials. Teachers don't have them, parents lack guidance, and children do not have the books they need to learn to read. Next slide, please. In Zambia, similarly, the Ministry of Education has no budget for essential reading materials. Their budget is limited to, I think, 0.2% of their education expenditure is made on textbooks, and there simply is no room for essential reading materials. So the planning and forecasting is all for textbooks only. In title development, the lack of reading culture and thus low demand for books accentuates that issue. So publishers cannot develop essential reading materials as the ministry doesn't fund them, and there's no market outside of the ministry. Publishing and printing, again, lack of market demand and incentive, corruption scandals that have prevented donor pooled funding, and tensions between a market-based textbook provision and state monopoly, which have accentuated the weaknesses in the sector. For purchasing, there's a lack of a protected line item for essential reading materials. Also, publishers report delays in payments of up to 4 years, which has left them in very difficult straits. In distribution management, books don't make it from the district offices. The ministry delivers to the district offices and schools are responsible for the last mile delivery. That doesn't happen. And there is no track and trace. So then down to active use and those children, schools and homes have no books, and parents lack the kind of guidance that they need to support children's literacy. Next slide, please. The key recommendations that have emerged from these reports are that the Global Book Alliance should support the Zambian and Malawian Ministries of Education in the establishment of a coordination group, such as a National Book Council, In order to create national policies around books, rebuild trust and collaboration between the Ministry of General Education and the private publishers, promote books and reading, and support efforts to create consistent and predictable funding for books. These councils we recommend should be built within the ministry to be locally oriented and supported by outside partners. The Global Book Alliance then recommends the formulation within these councils of a national book policy and implementation plan. The book business in both Zambia and Malawi, as we've just seen, is fragmented and divided. And a national book policy would outline the overall relationships between the public and private sector and allow the many stakeholders in the book sector to cooperate on the common goal of bringing books to children. As with the council, we recommend that the book policy be developed within the Ministry of Education and supported by outside partners. And also that the National Book Council should undertake an analysis of public and private sector models, whether it's state monopoly, private sector publishing, or a hybrid, to address gaps in the book supply chain and to address the associated capacity building needs. In both countries, the results of the studies have been reported back to the ministries and other stakeholders. In both Zambia and Malawi, we're now beginning an intervention, which you'll hear about later, which will allow all stakeholders to gather together and create the national book policy that we've just discussed to address the issues that have been raised in our analysis. In Malawi, we'll also be conducting capacity building training for publishers and conducting a literacy advocacy campaign in communities across Malawi. So thank you all, and I look forward to the next speakers.
Okay, thank you very much, Juliana, for those insights and for all your hard work on bringing all of this together and for setting the scene for the discussions to come. You know, I realize I jumped into this and I didn't really introduce myself. Just to say, I'm Scott Walter. I'm the Deputy Director of the Global Book Alliance and also the Executive Director of Canadian NGO Code. So our next speaker is Sarah Kreitz, Director of Education at USAID Zambia. Since 2009, Sarah has been working with USAID's education team, first in Washington, D.C., and then in Ghana before her current tenure in Zambia. A bilingual educator by training, Sarah was a community education advisor for the Peace Corps in Honduras and continued her work with the Peace Corps in Washington, D.C. Sarah studied international affairs at George Washington University and has a master's in education from George Mason University. Sarah will present a number of Zambia-specific learnings across the book supply chain. Over to you, Sarah.
So hello, everyone, from wherever you are in the world. Again, my name is Sarah Kreitz, and I am really happy to be here with everyone today to talk a little bit about the book supply chain analysis that was conducted in Zambia and really why I think we felt it was important to us from the USAID perspective and why we felt it would be useful for both our programming with the Ministry of Education in Zambia and also for Zambia in the longer term. So I think, I would say that for several years, we've had some experiences from USAID in Zambia of working in various stages of book development, printing, and distribution, and have seen a number of challenges, but really I think have not really systematically examined those challenges and really tried to examine them in a way that we can really get to some better solutions. Instead, I think we ended up, really typically through projects looking at very short-term kind of interventions to address some bigger core issues. So we felt that the supply chain analysis opportunity through the BI was really a great means for us to really try to aggregate, a lot of our feelings and really put them down into some deeper analysis. So I would say just in terms of context, so USAID has been working with the Ministry of Education in Zambia really since 2014 in implementing a new primary literacy curriculum. And I think for anyone who's ever worked on curriculum, I think that if there's a really committed effort to rolling out a curriculum completely throughout a system, it's something that does take years of effort. So, from 2014, really to 2016, USAID worked closely with the ministry to really kind of finalize the curriculum and really facilitate that to happen. But then the next step, of course, becomes really trying to bring that curriculum into implementation into the system and into the classroom. So of course, everything from training teachers to providing materials, and I think that's where I think some of our recent awareness of kind of practically how Zambia's book supply chain functions. I think it just came through that experience of really rolling out a new curriculum. So from really 2015 to 2019, we worked closely with the Ministry of Education, had in fact a direct government to government agreement, even with the Ministry of Education, to print or to develop and print and distribute all of the new teachers' guides and pupil textbooks aligned with the new primary curriculum to grades 1 to 4 through all schools, all primary schools in the country. About one book per 4 children, so it was not a one-to-one, but getting at least some of the initial books out into the system across about 9,000 schools. So I think to the earlier points on, what you see, as Juliana mentioned, about just, there can be this focus on textbooks. That for sure, I think, has been what we saw. The initial focus on really getting a new curriculum codified, really in the form of textbooks and teachers' guides, and that really ends up being the main books you would see in a classroom. And then the essential reading materials, or supplementary reading materials, as they're often called in Zambia, I think those have been really a developmental process, I think, just to really get those into classrooms. I think in terms of the, just to, I think, highlight a few more of the challenges just in the Zambian context, I think everything that Juliana mentioned about both countries, I think, definitely applies. I think for Zambia, what we've seen certainly in terms of the planning and forecasting for any types of books, whether they're textbooks or supplementary books or essential reading materials, it really, the planning ends up being very challenging, because often we end up working, and the ministry ends up working with data that might be usually about 3 years behind. So consequently, the number of schools, for one, ends up not being quite accurate for what you plan. The number of pupils enrolled also ends up not being quite accurate for who is actually there in the present day. So that's one of the things that really does make it challenging to really get into that kind of really detailed planning. So I think, and again, the focus has really been mostly on, when there is a budget for materials in schools, it's really been about providing those core textbooks as opposed to other types of reading materials. One of the things I think we've also seen in Zambia is, so Zambia also has, over the years, moved from having a both a combination of kind of private publishing to then really government managed, centralized publishing, and then sort of a hybrid. So it's been a little bit of a back and forth over time, which does make it challenging also, I think, in terms of, where does one particular printer or publisher have a particular niche or comparative advantage in a market for book publication. And I think, we've seen that, usually there's not a conversation about books and planning and forecasting until it comes time that there are resources to provide for publishing. So then once you get to the point that you can actually start to have a discussion about books and how to really make sure the supply chain is functioning as it should, it's again with kind of this, resource question, which I think then ends up, driving a little bit of that competition that we see between both the kind of centralized and private publishers. And again, as I just mentioned, I think, or alluded to, I think, really, I think the lack of funding, I mean, there's been typically very, very few resources, I think, through the government budget for books or learning materials. Over the past, I would say, probably 6 years in Zambia, most of the education budget, as in over 90%, has been dedicated entirely to salaries for the system, and that's really teachers, and that's primarily teachers. But that really allows so little for any other resources or any other supplies, even, and especially books, to be able to provide it to schools. So that really, I think, is one of those things that really does make it very, very challenging to really try to, again, create a cycle that you want to see where you can plan and you can predict. But despite all this, of course, there's always a silver lining. I think there are definitely some opportunities, which we've seen. And I think there definitely is a concerted effort and awareness, I think, from the Ministry of Education that we certainly see as a partner. There has been, even prior to conducting this supply chain analysis, there had been some work done with the World Bank to examine last mile distribution of materials, and then look at also ways to incentivize to make those last mile links happen. And that's another interesting study too, which we can share. And then also looking at really updating the textbook procurement guidelines and criteria for selection of materials. There's also a very, there's a great history and actually tradition in Zambia, I think, of really taking oral traditions and also putting them into writing. And so you see that in communities. And I think when you have very creative and motivated teachers, you see that happening in classrooms where you see oral traditions come to life in a text. And that's something that really is a very positive thing that you see all over the country that really can, I think, be a base for creating more materials at very low cost. This is something I think that we see, really where, there's definitely a potential to support local writers and illustrators to help them be trained and really help strengthen the book and publishing industry. And then one final opportunity I just want to mention, I think that we've seen recently. So Zambia in August of this year had its national elections, which marked its seventh government, seventh transition of power, transition of party. So there was a lot of change from the president ministerial levels down. There really was a promise to Zambia about rebuilding the economy, and then for youth, increasing skills and education for youth. And I think this election was really marked by a very significant youth power. So I think that is, trying to really look at the youth dividend and how youth contribute to Zambian society has been a real focus for the new government. And we've seen how that is even reflecting in the 2022 budget in the form of increasing teacher recruitment in a way that has not been seen for many years, and also increasing school grants and resources to schools so that there can be greater quality of education, reaching more children in the country. So I think as we look at what we will do, I think as we move forward with the findings of this analysis, so we are working with the GBA team currently in the mission, and with the Ministry of Education and stakeholders in the book and literacy community in Zambia to really consult and really examine some of the issues in the supply chain, and then look at really how we can develop a national book policy. In fact, I just had a conversation today with someone in the ministry who actually said that a book policy is actually part of the ministry's 2022 policy agenda. So they actually said that's one of the things they really want to focus on. This is something that I think we are prepared to support from USAID with other partners, and also looking at how we can expand partnerships with private partners, really to try to meet the demands of books in classrooms. All right, I think I will wrap it up from here, since I think I'm taking us behind time. Over, thanks.
Great, Sarah. Thank you very, very much. And thank you for your entire team for their support and engagement for this work in Zambia. So we're going to turn our focus to Malawi now. Our first SCA was undertaken in Malawi, and Ramsey Sosola from USAID Malawi joins with our partner from the Ministry of Education, Lindiwe Chide, I hope I'm saying that right, to talk about some of their initial learnings. Ramsey is the Senior Program Management Specialist, Higher Education, and joined USAID Malawi in 2007, having worked previously for the government of Malawi as an education planner responsible for policy analysis, budget preparation, and monitoring and reporting. He's also worked for the European Union as a monitoring and evaluation specialist. He's an economist by training and has classroom experience at the secondary school level. Ramsey holds a Bachelor of Social Science from Chancellor College and a postgraduate diploma in education planning and management from the University of Malta. Lindiwe joined the Malawian Ministry of Education in 2005 as a planning officer in the monitoring and evaluation section. She's now responsible for curriculum development, implementation and evaluation, material development, but also quality assurance for schools and colleges, amongst other things. She spends her days planning, organizing, and supervising all activities of methods development and evaluation functions, directing and coordinating school and college inspection activities, developing policy proposals for changes in method and curriculum, and managing a team of inspectors and advisors at headquarters, division, and district levels. So together they'll speak to us about specific learnings from Malawi. Over to the Malawi team.
Thank you very much. We'll take you through the Malawi learnings on the supply chain analysis that was carried out in Malawi in 2019. Outside of the limited donor projects, what we've seen as challenges in Malawi is that we don't have a systematic initiative to increase the availability of books, especially in the schools, but also for children in our homes. And also that our current supply chain is mainly focused on just textbooks. We also have concerns hovering around corruption, since this is an area that is mainly led by donors, and we have limited resources in this. There are usually parallel systems that are being set, giving us challenges in all that. After we carried out the supply chain analysis, there were some recommendations that were made, and these included the creation of a book policy and the book sector development plan. And I'm pleased to report that we've actually embarked on this process, starting with our first workshop actually today. We just finished early afternoon. But we're also trying to make sure that there should be a strong government and donor coordination to address issues of data, collection of data, and the use of the data that we collect for forecasting and bringing these materials in our schools, but also our communities. But also there's need for adequate budget for the essential reading materials, but also supplementary on the market. What we've seen is that it's mostly government that is the main buyer of these books or reading materials when they are there. So, but we want to have enough materials and enough budget so that they can be made readily available to all our stakeholders. I'll hand over to Rams to take us through the next two slides.
Thank you, Lindiwe, for the introductory part and setting this the stage. I think basically I'm going to take you through the stages of book chain recommendations. I think basically from the Malawian context, some of the issues about how the book industry is responding to the needs is to do with the issues of taxation on paper, which makes our book providers uncompetitive in terms of international versus the local. So one of the issues that we're trying to deal with at the moment is to talk to the responsible government agencies to look into the issue of paper costing, so that our printers and publishers do not go outside the country to print their books and bring them back to Malawi. I think that is more or less killing the local industry in terms of the provision itself. So I think that's one of the issues that is making our book provision problematic, because the players in the country would not see it profitable in terms of providing the books. Also, I think there are issues about how can we incentivize the industry to be timely in terms of book production, book provision, but also book delivery, and looking at how best we can reduce the cost in a way that is also efficient. We are also looking at issues to do with the training of PTA members on how they can help in the way they can make sure that there's accountability in terms of books arriving in the amounts required and in the quantities that were provided. So I think in terms of having done the supply chain analysis and what the findings were, I think the book policy issue comes up at the top. We needed to have a book policy which lays out the frameworks and the guidelines and more or less the regulatory frameworks. I think at the moment, if you look at the findings, the books supply chain is almost in disarray. So I think there's need for a bit of order in the system, ensuring that all the players, all the stakeholders are adhering to the needs of the education sector, but also ensuring that each player clearly understands their role in terms of the provision of the books. I think there are a lot of interested parties in the system, and more like a monopoly of supply of books in the system, which makes it even difficult to get the books on the market. So looking into that issue of policy, regulatory framework, and ensuring that there is order in the system will also help us in terms of the players coming in with a lot of necessary inputs. And I think going also alongside the book policy, we are looking at the creation of a National Book Council. Again, at the moment, we are looking at setting up a task force, and the task force will be all inclusive in terms of the players, so that there's a voice coming out of that consolidated framework, ensuring that the system has adequate books and also adequate provision of resources. So in terms of where we are at the moment, we have a workshop going on right now, which is bringing in government senior officials in terms of making sure that the government, who is a bigger player in the sector, upfront is on board. And when we next do other work, we are again with the government. So I think the next step will be also coming up with a workshop that is going to be all inclusive, and in January, where stakeholders will come sit down and look at issues of the book policy. The other thing that we are looking at in terms of now the broader GBA support is also working with the publishers on their training. We would like to train publishers in terms of creation of supplementary books, children reading books. I think, as you have already heard from the context, at the moment, the supply of books is mainly concentrated on textbooks. So the textbooks have been the ones that have been supplied, but we are looking towards expanding books available. Textbooks have always been school-related material, but we also want materials for the households. We also want materials for the market, so that books are on shelf and also books are available in the homes and in school. The other main component that we are also looking at, which is also going to be part of the policy, is how do you get the community engaged? Again, we would want reading culture to be expounded, and in a way that the reading culture can only come on board if materials are available, that people can demand for books, can find them, and also can pay for the books. At the moment, the system all depends on government supply or donor supply. And if books are lost or books are needed to be replaced, I think there's no replenishment strategy. And even parents, PTAs, school committees may want to get books from their own resources. Those books are not readily available. So we are working on that, mainly having also a small study to understand what's going on in that sector. And to sum it all, we need to do some system strengthening. I think the supply chain is more of a system. And I think we have talked at the beginning that the system is not functioning in a proper manner. We acknowledge that there are elements of the system which are working. Maybe some are just stopgap measures to put things going. But at the end of the day, we need to find a system which is functional. So we are looking at capacity building of entities within the system, mainly government entities, to be able to forecast the material needs and also resource provision in general, like the requirements of how much is needed to supply in the system. So I think basically, to sum it up, I think this is what we are working on and we are doing towards achieving our objectives. I think I can end here.
Okay, thank you very much. Some really important insights there, and particularly good news, I think, to see about the creation of the National Book Council. So thank you very much, Lindiwe and Ramsey, for your engagement on this and the partnership together that's making this impact. So we're going to head back to Zambia now and to join two speakers who will discuss the supply chain analysis from the perspective of the overall book sector in which they work. So we have Constantine Mupunde, Senior Librarian at Zambia Library Services, followed by Mavuto Zulu, a publisher based in Zambia. Constantine is a librarian, teacher, and author working for the Zambian Library Service. He's represented Zambia at various high-level meetings and presented papers on the role of a library in national development. He's co-authored a number of English textbooks at different levels for the Zambian syllabus and holds a bachelor's degree with library and information science from the University of Zambia. He's currently studying for his master's degree at the same university to add to his diplomas for both primary and secondary school teaching. Mavuto is a longtime publisher in Zambia and now works for the Squirrel Book Center and Publishers in Zambia. He was the last country manager for Longman, Zambia, where he had worked for 17 years and which closed their doors to the Zambian market at the end of January 21. He now exclusively represents Pearson Education Africa on the K-12 list and is a qualified mathematics and science secondary school teacher with 8 years experience in the classroom. Constantine, why don't we start with the impact of this analysis for the library services and the book market in general in Zambia? Over to you.
Thank you very much. Welcome everybody to this short Zambian presentation. First of all, the Ministry of Education in Zambia is the one which is responsible for activities that are dealing with book policy in Zambia, although the book policy itself is not in place at the moment. So a department or a unit called Zambia Library Service was established sometime in 1962 by the government of Zambia. So this is the one which whose mandate is to manage public library networks throughout Zambia to ensure the establishment and coordination of libraries in schools, colleges of education, and teachers' resource centers. So it also provides timely and relevant information in various formats to assist other organizations providing library and information services and training, and also the training of other service providers who are in the business of library service provision. Now, this sector has, I mean, these responsibilities have made the officers at Zambia Library Service to move extensively throughout the country, where we have noticed a number of flaws regarding the book distribution. There are serious problems regarding the book distribution. The most important thing that has made it even worse is that as our first colleague pointed out on the Zambian side, the staffing, teacher staffing is seriously affected because there are very, very few teachers in some cases, especially in rural schools. Rural schools have very, very few teachers. Now, if there are no teachers and then there are also no books, it becomes very difficult for children to break through to literacy. So literacy has gone down and has been down, and as a result, we also end up having poor reading culture at the end of the day. So when you look at the book pupil ratio, yes, we have in many cases where we have 3 or 4 learners to one book. And sometimes in some serious cases, there are places where we have gone in rural areas where we found only one book being read by someone, or either a learner or a teacher, reading to the class. So that makes it one book to 50 pupils in very serious cases, especially in very rural parts of the country. Right, when we look at key learnings from Zambia, the book learner ratio, very bad in rural areas. In some cases, it goes to 50 learners to one book. That means one standing in front reading to the rest of the class. In most cases, there are no supplementary reading materials, very few books for so many learners in most cases. Yes. The issue of books in rural areas is worse than it is in here. So in rural areas, there are no supplementary reading materials, and the issue of teachers in schools is made worse by the issue of not having so many books. Yes, the emphasis is on curriculum books in our country. But one thing is that even as we emphasize the curriculum books, there is also the issue of cross-cutting. Cross-cutting issues are those issues that are taught alongside the curriculum which is in place. So all forms of learning which is useful to the learner will be taught as a cross-cutting issue, even if it's not completely covered by the syllabus. Now, assistance from cooperating partners in terms of reading materials is critical here, because in Zambia, we do not have a budgetary allocation for supplementary reading materials. Most of the books which we are found here are run by the Curriculum Development Center, who make it a point that the books which are in line with the curriculum, the syllabus, are available, although they may not be in right quantities, but that is the job. There is no money, no allocation for supplementary reading materials. Even those books which support the curriculum per se are not usually available because of the limited resources in our country. So our partners, cooperating partners, are very critical in this area, and that is where we find it difficult. And there is also need for local language books, because in Zambia, from grade 1, in fact, from early childhood education through grade 1 to grade 4, the books that are normally there are grade, their learning is in their local languages, the local languages that they understand. And the book publishers here in Zambia have no such books, and they are on the market. So that is one aspect. When we teach the children how to read, first of all, they start with the local language, and then later on, that's when at grade 5, that's when English is introduced, and that's when the they continue. That's where they continue from. Support for local language books is therefore critical. And in most cases here, Ministry of Education, what we normally do is we avoid the cumbersome way of funding going to the ministry. Normally, books are identified by ourselves. Just identify the suppliers. Then the cooperating partner will simply request us to provide delivery notes. The delivery note comes, this book have provided, have given us the books. Therefore, payment does not come to the ministry. It goes straight to the people that supply the books, so that we cut on those cumbersome ways of procurement and so on. So it make it a bit actually simpler and more straightforward. Then the distribution to distant, hard to reach areas. In Zambia, some places are very, very difficult to reach. Not long ago, we went out on Lake Bangwe. Lake Bangwe is a huge depression lake, which is very, very big indeed. And there are a lot of people who are settled on the island there. And to reach that place, it is very, very difficult. We actually have to move. And when you move with the books that you have, you need to go and train them how to use these books with children, so that the books can be beneficial to the children. So after that, then traveling again, very, very difficult. But of course, with resources, it makes things much easier, because people can move, can hire a boat so that they reach that, and also train the people there how to use the books with the children. Training of education providers and librarians in basic library management schemes. That is the training I'm talking about. Support of implementation strategies, which will help such programs, classroom libraries, and stand-alone libraries. The role of the private sector. The private sector is complementing. Most of the books in Zambia, most of the schools in Zambia are owned by the government. So the private sector are there to complement, and also for our colleagues in the for the colleagues that are helping us, we would also want to emphasize that early childhood through grade 1 to grade 4 is critical, because a child must be literate that time. They must break through to literacy that time, so that they are able to start reading at that time, and then learning becomes easier. So provision of books at that level is critical. We'll be very, very grateful to have an assistance from colleagues in that area.
Thank you. And Mavuto, we want to hear from you and to get your comments on the supply chain analysis and what it means for publishers in Zambia.
No, thank you very much. I should mention that 90% of the books that are in the education system from grade 1 to grade 12 comes from the private sector. And the public publisher or the government publisher has no books from grade 1 to grade 12 in the core course books, but they do have books for literacy. Having said that, I think that the private publishers are willing to collaborate with cooperating partners, with the Ministry of Education, and we have been doing a lot. And our survival mainly now depends on books on the shelf, because the tendering process and procedures are very difficult. Sometimes a tender takes 2 years for the results to be published, and we can't survive in such an environment. Not even the public publisher can survive in such an environment. But the underlying factor is that funding is the main key issue. And even when funding is there, ring fencing it has not been there. So it goes like earlier on, someone mentioned that, is it Sarah who mentioned that 90% of the funding that goes to the Ministry of Education goes towards emoluments, salaries, and so forth and so on, and that leaves a paltry percentage, and it can't sustain over 10,000 schools that Zambia has. Are there any opportunities? Yes, we do have a lot of opportunities. The coming of programs like this one, I think it's an opportunity that we can take with both hands, provided all the loopholes that have been mentioned, corruption, procurement, bureaucracy, and so forth and so on, are handled with the strictest care. Otherwise, your coming has brought a sigh of relief to the private sector in the publishing industry. I think suffice to mention that funding in the books of accounts for the government is always there, but the issue is to spend it in that fiscal year. That has been missing over the years. So we hope that your coming will improve literacy, and I think my colleagues and I, the private sector, is ready to hit the ground running, provided there is a roadmap about this program. I thank you.
Thank you so much. You know, the National Library Service and the private sector publishing industry are so critical to this whole discussion about getting great books into the hands of children. So we really appreciate your comments. Thank you again. Sarah and Ramsey, we're going to turn to you for a couple of quick concluding comments about what all this means for the work that USAID and the Global Book Alliance will do in country going forward. So if I could hand it over to you, Sarah, for a quick comment.
Okay, thank you. I'll try to summarize briefly. So I think, you know, as I touched on a little bit earlier, you know, I think one of the really key next steps that we would like to take is really to look at dissemination and consultations concerning the findings of the book supply chain analysis in Zambia. You know, I think just due to travel and restrictions on gatherings in this past year, we haven't been able to do that sooner, unfortunately. We're hoping that when the conditions permit and hopefully this Omicron variant controls itself, then hopefully we can make that happen very soon. As I mentioned also, the ministry is interested in a book policy. This is something that we would be really, really happy to support. I think continuing to build on the work from the GBA support and the supply chain analysis to really help contribute to a meaningful policy. As I mentioned earlier, I think, you know, I do think the conversations around books and the book supply chain, just the whole every phase of really just the development of content to the tendering and the procurements for printing materials, distributing materials, it's all so important. And I do think it would be really helpful just to have a conversation, you know, really, I think with ministry and all key stakeholders that are involved in the publishing industry and in the literacy community, and with partners who support education, just to really have a discussion of, you know, what does the supply chain need to be stronger, and how can we contribute in very meaningful ways. I think having a discussion, you know, that's really outside of any sort of specific procurements is so important, because I think we usually, as I mentioned, tend to have these discussions when we know there is a tender that's coming for a specific book procurement, but then that ends up driving the conversation rather than really looking at some of the core issues in the system and the supply chain. I think also just one thing that we are looking forward to doing, and we're starting to do already, since we know, I think that particularly the last mile distribution and utilization is such a challenge. There are many challenges, of course, but I think that last step can be so challenging. I think really once books get close to the source and close to the school, but are still not in the hands of children in classrooms. One thing we started doing through our programs this year in primary school classrooms for early childhood up to grade 3 is really doing monitoring through one of our larger projects to examine book utilization. And then we're also employing third-party monitoring to do random spot checks to really see, our books in classrooms, are they being used? And we actually been really happy to see, just from our initial data that we just have collected, that utilization is actually really higher than we thought. Actually, in a sample of about 1,000 schools, we found that 90% of classrooms were actually using recently provided materials, which were all in the essential reading material categories, so supplementary readers that are really supplementing the primary literacy curriculum. So that is very encouraging. And I think really encouraging that practice, I think is something that we're really committed to doing. So I'll pause there and yield the floor to my Malawian colleagues. Over.
Well said, Sarah. Thank you very, very much. And Ramsey, over to you before we wrap up.
Okay, so I think I did mention already my next steps, but I think I can still emphasize some of the points. So after the supply chain analysis in 2019, again, we acknowledge that this is a couple of years back. And I think COVID did play a part in the way this whole entire activity was managed because of the fact that the report came after a couple of years. What we are doing right at the moment is to get more of an update to the issues. And I think the issues haven't really moved away from the original supply chain analysis. So we are still using the supply chain analysis as the basis for our work. And I think all the recommendations that are contained in the supply chain analysis helped us design what we're calling an innovative teaching and learning materials activity. And in that teaching and learning materials innovative activity, it's where we are looking at objective number 1, which is national book policy. The objective number 2 is training of publishers on content development for children reading books, which we also acknowledge that the traditional book provision has been on textbooks. So I think that would be like a pilot sort of developing a few titles through the private sector, and then see how those materials can go into the market. So we are likely to have a direct link to the market, to the community, to the PTAs. That's why objective number 3 looks at the community engagement, the SBCC, and also studying the various early grade reading activities that also try to work on this space. And I think we want to learn what happened and what went wrong. So I think before moving into the future in terms of SBCC, we are taking stock of the previous activities, but also we are trying to see how we can message everything else in a way that communities are on the demand side of books. And I think I mentioned how the private sector can play a role in terms of making books available for the community for purchase and for home use. So I think that's where we're working. And the final bit of it is the capacity development of the ministry to do the planning, focusing, and resource mobilization. So those are the pieces that I can mention for now. Over.
Okay, really, really key points, Ramsey. Thank you very, very much. This is such an important discussion. If we want to get children reading, they got to have something to read. And to have something to read, we need books. And that means getting the book chain functioning effectively and efficiently. So it's frustrating, but very, very important discussion. Look, and now it's my pleasure to hand things over to friend and colleague Henry Chikava, the new chair of the Global Book Alliance Steering Committee, for Henry to wrap things up. Over to you, Henry.
Thank you, Scott. The developing world faces many challenges in its book production, producing affordable books in languages which its children can understand, to learn to read, and read to learn. Lack of government policies and actions that encourage the publishing of high-quality books locally. The continued use of foreign languages as opposed to local languages in early childhood education is a worrying trend. Lack of professionalism, few editors, few designers, printing technology, and color work. Lack of investment capital, which can encourage private publishers to invest in longer-term projects and move away from publishing only textbooks. Linguistic challenges, inadequate orthographies that make it impossible to produce highly readable books in local languages. Lack of distribution channels that can enable books to be distributed to every part of the country. There's limited road, rail, and air travel. Postage and computer services are expensive. There are few bookshops and library networks. Literacy, poor book reading and book buying habit have negative effect on the book market. Moreover, the book purchasing power is much reduced by extreme poverty, with families struggling barely to make ends meet. The absence of a reading environment, with most rural areas not under electrification. The need to lobby governments for a tax system that encourages local production of books, both from publishers and printers. Lack of research to establish where the gaps are and offer relevant training in those areas. I could go on, but today's speakers have given us insights into all these areas and more. I would like to sincerely thank them for their contributions. I would like to also thank the audience for finding time to join us in this webinar and for raising relevant questions. Action is needed on all the issues raised, such as formulation of book policy committees and the establishment of national book councils. I would like to call upon GBA partners to consider following up some of these areas. So with all these few remarks, I declare the webinar officially closed. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Henry. And believe me, we're certainly looking forward to your tenure as chair of the Global Book Alliance. I think Sarah has given us an appropriate comment at the end saying, don't count out the traditional book, the printed book. The digital world is a wonderful thing, but for the reading public and an environment that we envision, the traditional book still has a very, very important place to play. Okay, well, look, thank you, everyone. Thank you to the audience. If you would like to hear more, to see more about the Global Book Alliance, please go to our website at globalbookalliance.org. And just to thank all of our wonderful speakers, Juliana, Sarah, Ramsey, Lindaway, Constantine, Mabuto, thank you all for participating today, looking at how we can strengthen the global book chain and ensure more books get into the hands of readers around the world. We're hoping you'll join us for our next book series events in 2022. We hope we'll have our technology worked out by then, so stay tuned, stay well, and keep reading. Thank you very much.